Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our next lecture in the virtual series entitled Discover Ukraine, History, Culture and its People. This event has been organized by the Basel Study Group for Minority History. We would like to thank our partners URIS, Ukrainian Research in Switzerland Initiative, Universidad Internacional de Cuernavaca, Oriente Media News, Bnei Brit Chile, and Círculo Israelita de Santiago for bringing this course to Latin America. We would like to remind you that this is a fundraising event for Razum for Ukraine emergency response, and I will post the link to this initiative in the chat. My name is Olena Palko, and I'm a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at Birkbeck College in London, and a co-convener of the Study Group for Minority History. We will be recording this session, and the video will be made available on the Study Group YouTube channel. You can find there the recording of our previous sessions. Please send your questions to me directly or keep them until the end of the lecture if you wish to ask them directly. Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Boris Belge. Boris is an SNF Ambizione postdoctoral fellow at the University of Basel, and currently a visiting scholar at the University of Illinois in the US. His project, Managing Trade, investigates infrastructure and economic practices in the port of Odessa in 1794 to 1905. He is the author of Klingende Sowjetmoderne, eine Musik- und Gesellschaftsgeschichte des Spätsozialismus, published in Cologne in 2018. This is a study of music in late Soviet socialism. His research interests include trade, the economic and maritime history of Ukraine and Imperial Russia, as well as social and cultural history of late socialism. Today, his presentation is entitled From Grain of Wheat to Gas Pipeline, Ukraine's Economy from the 18th to the 21st Century. And I just want to say that this talk on Ukraine's economic history is particularly important given the dangers posed to the world by the Russian aggression. And we hear multiple reports on the dangers of world hunger as a result of interrupted grain and other foodstuff deliveries from Ukraine. That's why I believe this talk will provide us with the necessary context to understand the importance of Ukraine in world economy. Thank you, Boris, for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Olena. Thank you to all the organizers for inviting me to this lecture series, and it's a great pleasure and honor to participate in it. Well, I'm gonna start right now, and I'm gonna share the screen. So my lecture is entitled From Grain of Wheat to Gas Pipeline, Ukraine's Economy from the 18th to the 21st Century. And Olena was already so kind to stress the importance of that issue right now. I guess most of you have heard or seen about the actual situation in Odessa, where the grain from the Ukrainian harvest basically is sitting in the port, not able to be shipped out since the Black Sea now is under blockade from the Russian Navy. And this is a big catastrophe unfolding right in front of our eyes. So you can see basically the grain sacks that were supposed to hold the grain and to get the grain on the ships, now filled with sand, stuck in front of the buildings to protect it from bombardments. This will be one of the most horrific collateral damages, I guess, of the war spreading upon the entire world now. So I guess it's important to understand a bit about how Ukraine's economy is structured, what it is about, and what does that tell us. So, and the second one, the second introduction I'd like to make is that since this is a fundraising lecture, and I'm very happy to participate in that, particularly for that reason, since Razum for Ukraine is a great initiative, that's also kind of striking that in times of need, there is, money is needed and donations are needed. basically for people to buy food, clothes, and pay for accommodation. And that is basically what economy is. So my lecture is about what makes the people of Ukraine able to buy food and clothes, pay for accommodation, get incredibly rich, or suffer poverty. It's about the economy, one of the driving forces of history. And in my lecture, I will illuminate some areas of Ukraine's economic history from the 18th century until the dawn of the present Russian war on Ukraine. And I guess this is another facet of Ukraine's rich history that needs to be tackled in this lecture series, because basically economy and resources shape history as much as politics or culture or social events. Needless to say, it's impossible to cover every aspect and corner of Ukraine's economic history, and especially in such a long time frame. So I spent a lot of time thinking about how to deal with that problem. And what I decided I wanted to do is I intend to give you an insight into this multifaceted history by concentrating on 3 commodities or resources and 3 questions. So this slide shows 3 objects that can tell, I would say, a lot about Ukraine's economy. You can see from the left to the right, a grain or grains of wheat, a coal brick, and burning natural gas. One of the specific assets of Ukraine is that it's a country incredibly rich in raw materials and fertile soil. And so Ukraine's economy has been about food and energy for a long time, or is it until the present day? Ukraine is fueling, or has been fueling, both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, and last but not least, independent Ukraine after 1990. So what I wanted to do is that I will tell the story of these 3 goods, and that might help to get at least partial answers to some of the nagging questions about Ukraine's economic history. So the first question I would tackle is, who sets the course of the economy? This question is related to Ukraine being between autonomy and interdependence. And that is not only a question in after the 1990s, but that is a question of this particular region already in the imperial era in the 18th and 19th century and in the Soviet Union as well. So who decided for Ukraine upon economic goals? Speaking of these economic goals, the second question is which economic goals basically are followed? What are models? So this is more about economic ideologies, more about theories, and the basic discussions led from a range from protectionism to free trade. That is it more useful to protect the economy of Ukraine from foreign influence, or is it better to get it into the world, into global trade routes, and thereby to help develop it? And this is also a question that is tackled multiple times. And the last one is, what does this economic development tell about political, social, or cultural phenomena? That is a question that I would just touch a bit in this lecture, but that I would like to elaborate more in the discussion, because I think what I tried to tell you now might give some paths and traces towards things you've already heard in previous lectures about political and cultural phenomena. And I would like very much all of us to think about that close connection between economy and the other spheres of history. So these are the 3 questions I'm about to, at least to address. I don't think that I can give an answer, but I think that is something we all need to talk about and to think about. What I will do today is I will try to show you how understanding Ukraine's economy can help understand the place of present-day Ukraine in this imperial frameworks of Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union. So it is from a historical standpoint, and the consequences of that heritage that came with that situation. Before I start, please allow me 2 short remarks. First of all, in this lecture, I will avoid the question of when exactly and how Ukraine turned into a nation. I know that is a complex question, but I think from the standpoint of economy, it makes perfect sense to speak of the Ukrainian economy, and hence the title, from the 18th century onwards from an economic standpoint. Because this was a distinct economic region, or it were economic regions, separated from the Russian so-called, back then, so-called motherland. So when I speak of Ukraine today, I will treat the area that is today's territory of Ukraine. That's left and right bank Ukraine, southern Ukraine, and Crimea. Second of all, I'd like to state that my expertise lies in the history of grain production and export in the 19th century. So forgive me if I talk a bit more about that than about the other topics. Today, I will also address Soviet and post-communist Ukraine, but some of you might be more of an expert on this period, the 20th century, than I am. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, to additional and critical remarks about my ideas towards that period. So to give you at first an orientation, this is a map of 2006, and it shows the industrial products for every region of Ukraine. The numbers for sure have changed in absolute terms, but I guess the relations are what is most interesting. Because what you will immediately notice is that most mining and metallurgical production is concentrated in the southeast, in the center of the Donetsk coal basin, or the short version would be the Donbass, an area of mining comparable to the German Ruhrgebiet, which also fueled industrialization. So there's a heavy concentration of industry in the southeast of the country. Then there is a large spread of agricultural products. And then there is another concentration in the west. But I would like to draw your attention to this particular region because I will tackle that later. And then since we're talking about energy, I think we all have looked at these maps over the past few weeks and months all over again, but just to orient you, we have several atomic energy stations. This one is the one in Chernobyl. And yeah, that's basically how the industry is structured. So we have heavy concentration on the west and the eastern side, and around that region as well. But then we have also areas which aren't that industrially developed. This leads to the second map I want to show you, and this is a picture of Ukrainian soil, and it is very important to understand that, since that leads to a long-term perspective. Because what I want to do here is that I want to draw your attention to the red and gray areas, so these areas basically, and this one, where the so-called Chernozem and Castanosem, so the black soil and the brown earth, are. These soils are fertile soil, rich in humus, and therefore most appropriate for cultivating grain. And this is not a story about Ukraine at all, since these fertile soils have been exploited for centuries. Dates back to the Greek times, that this is one of the most productive soils and regions to cultivate grain. And this is very, very important. So this is where agriculture is particularly productive. So right until now, there had been a lot of remarks and introductions by me. And you might wonder, why do I have to know something about Ukraine's economy now? Why does it matter? Well, what I wanted to do is I wanted to start with one often used term for Ukrainian history that is basically, and that is often overlooked, fundamentally tied to the economy. There is an ongoing discussion about Ukraine being a colony inside the Russian Empire and getting colonized in the Soviet Union as well. But what we have to understand here is that the concept of colonialism at the beginning of its career was mainly defined in economic terms. So it was about control over resources. For example, you can see a definition: the policy of seizure and exploitation of foreign, mostly overseas territories, especially by European countries between the 16th and 20th centuries. Colonialism is characterized by the territorial expansion of a state's power through long-term military, political, and/or economic control over the subjugated colony. Or a bit later, you can see the definition: the process of control of supplies of raw materials, mineral resources, and markets in underdeveloped and pre-capitalist regions. So that is the basic definition of what colonialism is. And that had led to the idea that maybe there is some colonization happening in the Russian Empire as well. And there are different types of colonialism identified. So that is settler colonialism. That is basically, so the model for that would be the colonialism of Northern America and Southern America, where where settlers develop these forms of colonies. Then there is exploitation colonialism. That is more about the exploitation of resources. And then we have a third type, which is not that important, but then we have internal colonialism. And internal colonialism is specifically important here, since that is understood as basically a state colonializing itself. So inside a state, there would be regions that are dependent towards a center. And that is a often noted term towards how the Russian Empire in the 19th century functioned. And when looking for possible colonies, one might easily think of Ukraine being one of them. And that is what I want to tackle here. First of all, this is about control over resources and exploitation of resources. And you need people to do that. So you force people to go there to exploit these resources and to build cities, roads, and so on. And this basically leads to settler colonialism. And I want to ask myself, and ask this question to all of us, if there is some kind of internal colonialism in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union that might apply here, and to help understand about the place of Ukraine's economy. What has happened with that concept of colonialism is that, of course, over the past decades, our understanding of colonialism has widened considerably, bringing social, political, and cultural factors into the equation. So the so-called imperial churn of the 90s and 20s basically stimulated us to think of colonialism as more a cultural phenomenon. But I think that coming back to that economic definition might be helpful here. So coming back to our three objects, the grain of wheat, the coal brick, and the gas flame, I will try to explain and complicate and thereby simplify the notion of Ukraine being Russia's colony, and asking myself what that means. So I will do so by elaborating three different arguments. The first argument would be that the history of the grain trade in Ukraine tells us much about globalization and the creativity and ingenuity of peasants, merchants, engineers on the ground, but also about Ukraine being a cornerstone in Russia's imperial framework and the problems arising with that. Speaking about coal, I will develop a bit about that the Donbass basically was the coal mine of the Russian Empire, and in the 20th century was the steel plant of the Soviet Union. But Petersburg and Moscow's rule over Ukraine did not mean colonial exploitation of the latter entirely. Instead, Ukraine's east became an industrial center by itself, with a lot of pride and influence. And then, speaking about natural gas, these gas pipelines leading through Ukraine undisputedly tied Ukraine's economy to Russia's economy, a problem that became violent in the 1990s and the early 2000s, when both states drifted apart after Ukraine's independence, and therefore there were tensions that had to be solved, and that explains a bit about the prehistory of the 2010s, when Ukraine finally decided to part ways with Russia. So let me explore these three arguments more in detail. First grain, then coal, then gas. But first of all, and before I tackle these three stories separately, I thought it might be useful to have some sort of chronology and basic facts assembled about the time frame assembled here. So Ukraine's economic history, when we agree to start that with the 17th and 18th century, we have these state formations of the Cossack Dom and the Hetmanate, where comparatively free peasants were mainly producing agricultural products. So that is cattle, oats, hemp, flax, and hops. And an important distinction is the cultivating of grain. So in the north, the somewhat colder north, it is rye, and in the south, it is wheat that is produced. We have some forms of basic rural industries, but what we also have is that already the Hetmanate in the 18th century started to export agricultural products to Russia, Poland, Lithuania, the Ottoman Empire, Austria, and Germany. So we have already an entanglement of the state formation with the surrounding economies. Then, with the reign of Catherine II, we have the forced economic incorporation of Cossack elites and Ukrainian regions into the imperial framework. And we have the increase in Russian land ownership. So Catherine's reign is very much about giving Russians land inside newly conquered territories. And so we have a Russification of that region in that sense. We have a weakened social and juridical position of peasants. And basically, right then, we have a diminishment and finally the enforcement of serfdom upon peasants according to the Russian model. The only region where that does not apply is southern Ukraine, the so-called new Russian territories, where the serfdom of peasants wasn't that much enforced, and that was basically a laboratory for another kind of societal formation. Then we have the Crimean War in the middle of the 19th century and the late imperial period, where the development of agriculture tremendously boomed, and Ukraine now basically was the breadbasket of Europe. So it was the largest producer of wheat in Europe, but it was contested since back then both Americas, Argentina, and Australia started to enter the grain market. And with the beginning of industrialization, the Donbass starts to become the steel plant of the empire, both in the Donbass and the Kryvyi regions. So these are two facets of that second half of the 19th century. So it's about about cultivating grain and producing coal and steel. At the beginning of the First World War, Ukraine still was a predominantly agricultural economy, and this economy collapsed basically after 1917. What the industry that was already developed basically was destroyed in the Civil War, and the ultimate hit was a famine of 1921, which led to catastrophic consequences. But Ukraine underwent a very rapid recovery, and it was basically the backbone of the first five-year plan of Stalin from 1928 to 1932, when Ukraine was the region where that economic growth was made possible. Then we have a period that I will tell a bit more later, that is Stalinism. When we think about World War, the occupation, and then late Soviet socialism, we have the forced collectivization and industrialization of Western Ukraine that was incorporated after the end of the World War II. We have last famines, and then we have a starting rivalry between two economic regions, that is Ukraine and Siberia. Both were very much about grain and coal and steel. Thinking of the era of the struggle for independence, that is from 89 to 2004, we have somewhat a crazy 1990s with mass strikes in Donbass, the decline of the industry. We have now the takeover of the economy from the old Soviet elites towards other elites, that is the oligarchs. We have hypercapitalization. We have clans and kleptocracy kicking in, which made use of the richness in resources in the 1990s. And then we have the 2000s, the present era, so to say, with gas wars with Russia and sanctions and economic entanglements with the EU. So that is just a very, very quick overview about basic features of Ukraine's economy over these 3 centuries. What I want to do now is that I will go into these 3 resources to elaborate a bit more on that. So as I already told, Ukraine is very much about grain. In fact, the flag is said to show a blue sky over a grain field, just to remind you of this blue-yellow flag. In the history of Ukraine, grain basically served 3 functions. It was a foreign trade good, a weapon, and of course, it was food. But first of all, let me speak of grain as a foreign trade good. So the territories of Ukraine have always been used to cultivate grain. Peasants grew rye in the north and wheat in the south, with small portions of oat and hops. Today, as you might know, sunflowers share a large proportion of Ukraine's field, but wheat is predominant. Russia claimed Ukraine's wheat early on. For example, in the times of Peter the Great, that is the late 17th century, left bank Ukrainian merchants were forbidden to deal directly with their Western counterparts, since the state tried to monopolize trade. In the middle of the 18th century, left bank Ukraine was integrated into the Russian market. So we have a strong influence of Moscow and then Petersburg towards Ukrainian economy, trying to hold a grip on that wheat. Catherine II's campaigns in the 1770s were also driven by the desire to get better access to the Black Sea and give Russia the ability to ship large quantities of grain outside of Russia. In 1794, Catherine founded the city and port of Odessa, which would soon become Russia's biggest port for the export of grain. And that is where my own research mainly takes place. So what was important about Odessa was that short transport routes to export fueled the rapid expansion of Ukraine's agriculture. It was very, very convenient to get the grain immediately to ships in Odessa and to ship it from there. And the hinterland of the Black Sea ports, then called New Russia or Novorossiya, developed into the breadbasket of Europe. In the 19th century, when the population of Ukraine and the Russian Empire grew and globalization started to kick in, a capitalist logic got a hold on grain cultivation. To Russia's economic planners, it was evident that they have to exploit Ukraine's soil as much as possible, since grain promised an export surplus that could be used. Russia back then wanted to join the so-called gold standard, that was a system of currency conversion, and therefore it needed that export surplus and the money coming from selling grain. And to be a member of that club of the gold standard states, it has that would have the benefit to increase the attractivity to foreign debtors immediately. And the plan to join this club was invented by Sergei Witte, the then finance minister. And that was basically a burden that was forced upon Odessa and the hinterland. So it was about producing as much grain as possible and to export as much grain as possible. And you can see in the graph on the left that right until the 1900s, the volume of trade going out of Odessa increases basically every year. So we have very few dips, which are mostly connected to wars happening. This one is the big famine of 1891, when there were bad harvests. But when we see the broader picture, we see an increase in that grain trade year by year. The downside to that was that Odessa basically was had an obstacle, and Russia basically tried to prevent, for example, an industry to be deployed in Odessa, since that was not what the port of Odessa was about. It was about exporting grain, and it was not about producing something out from imported goods, for example. So there were factories in Odessa, but Odessa basically had the problem that it was given that role of being solely the exporter of grain from the Russian Empire. So that is about foreign trade. So grain is useful to make money. The second use of grain is connected to the 20th century, when grain becomes a weapon. Because in the 1930s, Stalin and his entourage turned an eye on Russia's grain when he ordered the forced collectivization of the farmland. Ukraine, one of the agricultural hotspots of the Soviet Union, was hit to a catastrophic extent by this assault on the peasants. And you can see this catastrophic event in the map over here. This shows the decrease in population from 1929 to 1933. And in that dark red areas, we have a decrease in population of about 25%. And most of them died of hunger, since they were forced to give their grain and to suffer hunger instead. And this was a picture depicting this sacks of grain going out of the villages and leaving the people there basically to death. So in Ukrainian history, there is a term for that, that is the Holodomor. And one of the questions is if that is more about an economic rationale, or is more about basically getting the grain to the empire, willingly leaving people to die, or if it's about genocide, if it's about basically punishing the Ukrainian people. But I know that this is a very sensitive topic, but I think what we should not forget is that there is some kind of economic argument, at least, as a driving force behind these atrocities, because in official statements and arguments, it was all about collectivization of the agriculture and thereby transforming the economy. And this is at least a rationale that kind of contributes to that catastrophe unfolding. And speaking of people, millions of people starving and dying, this relates to my third point, that is that grain is, of course, first and foremost food. And there are several things one might think of. For example, that big armies need food as much as weapons, which becomes obvious in the present war as well, which is no exception to that. So supplying food is an essential task for states. And there were mainly two reasons when states were unable to fulfill that task, and that were famines and wars. While bad harvests had natural reasons, so for example, droughts, sandstorms, heavy rain, the resulting famines were often the cause of political mismanagement. In principle, Russia rarely suffered from harvesting too little grain, and would have been able to provide for its population by redistributing around the empire, so to integrate the several regions and providing from the grain stores. But this, however, did seldom happen. And secondly, wars tended to exacerbate the scarcity of food. For example, the grain fields of Ukraine were a battleground in both world wars, I want to remind you. And for example, the reason of the first revolution in 1905 and the February Revolution of 1917, and Ukraine was a major theater for that, lay in economic conditions. So it was about high bread prices and starving people. So that is also something we have to keep in mind, that this basic necessity of having food could also contribute to political forces. The situation kind of went on in the Soviet era. After the Holodomor and the Second World War, the economy of Ukraine in the agricultural sector recovered quite tremendously. This was also due to the fact that then General Secretary Khrushchev at least contributed to some concessions to the peasants to conduct small economies on their own. So, and peasants were incorporated into the welfare state, so they were able to make some money out of their products. But the problem was then in the 1970s that the deficiencies of the collectivized agriculture was kicking in. So the productivity of these fields was that bad that the Soviet Union basically became a net importer of grain in the 1970s. And this legacy of collectivized agricultural communities was something Ukraine suffered in the 1990s as well, because this cold war system was in place until basically 2000. And at the end of the 90s, the agricultural production had dropped to 50% of the 1989 level. So the system, how agriculture worked in the Soviet Union, was a very, very heavy heritage for Ukraine as well. So there was this recovery after 2000s, and 2008, Ukraine already ranked again 6th amongst the world's grain producers. And so the story of grain is as much about internal politics as it's about Ukraine's entanglements with Russia, Europe, and the world. Over 3 centuries, so we might give into the colonial framework here. Over 3 centuries, the Russian rulers tried to use the grain of Ukraine for their purposes, and basically stripping Ukraine from development opportunities arising from that. So after grain, to another kind of source of fuel, but another one. The story of grain could easily fit into a colonial narrative for Ukraine's history, I would say. But the story of coal is in some ways much more complicated. In fact, the beginning of coal mining in the southeastern Ukrainian region of Donbass, the Donetsk coal basin, in the 1870s marked a fundamental shift in its economy. Ukraine now started to develop into a major European industrial region and stopped being, quote unquote, only an agricultural supplier of grain for Russia's and Europe's economy. Before oil, coal was the dominant source of energy, and the Donbass provided over 80% of coal in the Russian Empire. And that is depicted in that poster, where the Donbass is characterized as the heart of Russia, where it pumps the blood into all the industrial centers in central Russia. So that is not about the center being in Moscow or Petersburg, but that is about the center being in Donbass. And on the right, you can see mine workers in the early 1900s. I will come to them a bit later. After the Civil War, the industrial production had fallen tremendously to 1/10 compared to the pre-war level. It was then Ukraine's coal that would fuel the recovery of the Soviet economy. And already in 1926, the Ukrainian industry was at 95% of the pre-war level. With Stalin's decision to force the industrialization upon the country, Ukraine became an even more important cornerstone of Soviet Union's economy in the 20s and 30s. Without Ukraine's coal and iron, the Soviet Union would not have been able to produce the amount of steel projected in the first 5-year plan. For example, in 1932, the industrial region of the bigger region, so that is Donbass, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kryvyi Rih, these produced 70% of hard coal and 70% of iron for the entire Soviet Union. These numbers are impressive from a global perspective as well. In 1937, the Ukrainian Soviet Republic was the third biggest producer of iron and the fourth biggest coal producer in the world. So in this first decade, southern Ukraine became an industrial region, and the number of industrial workers quadrupled in only a few years. And this was the period when southeastern Ukraine experienced a boost in urbanization and developed into one of the most populated areas. So for example, in the 30s, the population of Stadino, that is today's Donetsk, rose from 105,000 to 460,000, and the population of Zaporizhia from 56,000 to 289,000. In that table, you can see the development of coal production in Ukraine, and you can see the spike and the up spike happening in the 1930s, given Stalin's plan of heavy industrialization. And you can also see that this development holds on right until the 1970s. So there is a slow increase given the Second World War, but yeah, it holds true that the Donbass was some kind of the coal mine and the steel plant of the USSR in that sense. When we're not speaking about the resource, but about the people, I want to remind you that in Marxist and Bolshevik ideology, industrial workers were the core of revolutionary movements. And in the early 1900s, strikes by mine workers in southern Ukraine challenged the authorities and led to revolts during the first Russian Revolution in 1905. So the history of coal challenges a bit the narrative of Ukraine being a colony of Russia, because southern Ukraine became the place where the steel was tempered, to quote Ostrovsky's novel, and a bit adapt, in the late Russian Empire and the first decades of the Soviet Union. And this was made possible by large investments from foreign investors and protectionist policies that ensured the coal stayed in the country. The Donbass developing into the center of heavy industry transformed the region. Workers from all over the empire moved here. What developed now was not a Russification of the region, but instead the development of a specific regional identity filled with pride as being the heart of Russia, fueling the Soviet Union. So let me speak briefly about my third example and another source of energy, and that is natural gas. Most of us, I guess, or the older ones among us, might recall the gas wars of the early 2000s between Ukraine and Russia. And that is a story about Russia weaponizing its gas pipelines running to and through Ukraine to exert influence on Ukraine's political landscapes. So the problem was that Russia paid transit fees to Ukraine to lead their gas through Ukraine to Western Europe. And simultaneously, Ukraine paid very low prices for gas it needed for its own. And there was a constant tension about that problem in the 2000s, which became virulent in 2004 after the Orange Revolution. As part of the post-Soviet economic space, Ukraine benefited from reductions in gas prices and fees paid by Russia for flow rights. But how did that system happen to get into place? So where do these pipelines come from? These pipelines were built in 1973, and I guess this is a history that tends to get forgotten, because Ukraine in the 1970s had its own natural gas deposits. And after World War II, Soviet Ukraine was one of the main producers of gas inside Comecon, the eastern counterpart to the European economic community. Most of the gas needed in Poland came, for example, from Ukraine. In the late 1960s, West Germany reached out to the Soviet Union to satisfy its hunger for natural gas, given the multiple crises in the oil market. Given the growing demand for gas, the Soviet Union was only able to meet the growing demand if it could develop the vast gas fields in Western Siberia. However, Brezhnev's Soviet Union lacked the necessary funds for doing that and reached out to potential partners on the other side of the Iron Curtain. The US and Japan refused to respond to Brezhnev's call, but the Soviet Union and West Germany embarked on a new path of collaboration. The gas for pipes deal provided the Soviet Union with loans and pipes, around 1.2 million tons, to build new pipelines, under the condition that it would deliver 3 billion cubic meters yearly in natural gas to Germany. This was the biggest deal between the Soviet Union and Germany since the German invasion, and was then celebrated as a significant cornerstone of German Entspannungspolitik, easing tensions across the bloc and, in a pretty much teleological perspective, leading to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. This specific deal is at the roots of later economic entanglements between Germany, the Soviet Union, and its legal successor state, the Russian Federation. So there is this idea fix of making peace by making business. But one of these deficiencies that was overlooked was the tremendous costs of that politics forced upon Ukraine. As early as the winter of 1973, the Soviet Union experienced a shortage in gas supply, but still insisted on meeting its delivery obligations with Western partners. To fulfill these obligations, Moscow simply rechanneled natural gas designated for Soviet Ukraine to Germany, causing a major disruption to Ukraine's supply of gas. Factories were closed, households could not be heated. So Yeronim Perovich pointed out that, quote unquote, in the Soviet Union, the country with the world's largest proven fossil natural gas reserves, its own citizens, and that is Ukrainian citizens, were freezing. So this is an early example for what would then happen later. So denying Ukraine gas supply is no phenomenon of the post-Soviet era, but instead was deeply rooted in the German-Russian gas business. The tension between Russia and Ukraine intensified then after 1990. Ukraine became a transit country and a large importer. Making use of Ukraine being economically dependent and indebted to Russia, asserting pressure on the newly independent state was one form of tightening the grip. When Russia started to reduce its gas delivery again in 1993 and 1994, a major energy crisis broke out. The early 2000s were marked by ongoing negotiations between Russian and Ukrainian officials about the latter's step towards Gazprom, and the matter was only solved shortly before the outbreak of the Orange Revolution of 2004. And then in the late 2000s, there were this constant back and forth of negotiators between Russia and Ukraine about what to do with these gas pipelines. But what we can see is here is that from 2005 onwards, the gas imports from Ukraine from Russia tremendously decreased, and instead the European Union started to kick in. So we can see here this disentanglement of two former very much connected economies. This gas was of the 2000s and 2010s a very complex topic and issue, but what I want to say here is that what is also important is that there is this deterioration of the Russian side to bypass Ukraine at all, which is already happening then, and this is happening when they built the Nord Stream pipeline, trying to get the gas directly to Germany, thereby omitting getting the gas through Ukraine and holding back the transit fees for Ukraine, where it was dependent on. And the thing that is most important, I guess, is here that the Soviet Union emptied the gas fields of Ukraine in the 1960s and 70s. And when it was empty, it forced Ukraine to be an importer of gas from Russia. And so there is some kind of imperial legacy observable here that is especially important to think of. So, to come to a very brief conclusion, I think what is helping about thinking of Ukraine in an economic perspective is that it helps to follow the flow of goods in and outside of Ukraine, because it helps us to draw borders between regions. So we are able to take a closer look at the spatial order of Ukraine and the entanglement of Ukrainians' regions towards other countries, other regions. And I guess what is important here is that deliberately spoken of Ukrainian economy because I think that is applicable here. But of course, borders are both given and made. And if we think about the present borders of Ukraine, maybe it's important to think resources, soil, economics, politics, and culture together. The specificity of Ukraine is that right here, Ukraine is both a colony and at the core of the empire and the Soviet Union. And Willard Sunderland already reminded us of that decades ago, that there is an internal expansion and external expansion, which is proceeding together. And that holds particular challenges for Ukraine as well. And what we then observe from 1991 onwards is that there is an ambivalent entanglement with with European economies on the one side, and a disentanglement from Russian predominance. But this common past between Ukraine and Russia, and this imperial past basically, had a tremendous influence on the development of Ukraine's economy right until the beginning of the Euromaidan in 2014, and holds true until today. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm very much looking forward to your questions, and I will do my best to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Boris. It was really interesting, and I learned a lot because somehow this social economic aspect, often escapes you, right? It's when you look just on political or cultural history. So we are now opening the floor for discussion, and if you have questions, you can either type them in the chat or ask directly as well, whatever you prefer. Just maybe while we are waiting for the question, I was it's sort of a question or a reflection what your lecture made me think, and it's in the context of what we already heard in our lecture series with my lecture, for instance, and Stefan's lecture on the making of borders. I was thinking that there is this sort of a consensus that the Soviet regime, the Soviet government contributed to the making of identity, the borders, even culture, but at the same time, it seems that it came sort of at the cost of this economic dependency. And you showed it very well that there could be some sort of autonomy in the cultural spheres, perhaps like some kind of political decision making, but economically, Ukraine was very much integrated in the Soviet system. You did touch on this, but I just wanted to ask you, perhaps you can reflect on, those consequences for Ukraine and other former Soviet republics, of the breakup of the Soviet Union. How did this one economic unit, like what happened when it started disintegrating, basically? You touched on this, but maybe you could just reflect a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you. I guess this is a very, very important observation of yours that, well, I guess, yeah, they were true Marxists, right? So economy for them was at the bottom of everything, and they could allow for some kind of diversification of the Soviet Union with regards to language policy and to basically to power. But what was most important was the idea that this planned economy could only function if it's, if the power resides in the capital. And I guess the problem with that is that I guess there were some residues of that thinking in the 90s as well, because the idea was that, well, the Soviet Union broke up politically, but I guess the hope was that the economic entanglement of that location would survive that political breakup. And I think there were two challenges to that. The one was that, of course, the countries of Eastern Europe, and Ukrainian being one of them, noticed and basically observed the European Union as a very strong competitor to that and a very attractive way of doing economy in another way. And then there was this idea, and what I expressed basically referred to that who owns these resources. So it's I guess what is the nation about? So it's about the ownership of people and resources. And so the idea was, why should we follow these paths now that we are independent? And since these were the two, I guess, mental frameworks that were colliding back then, this basically contributed to these tensions. And I guess this is explains really a lot, since this is, I guess, something kind of a long shadow of the past, reaching into the 2000s and the 2010s, because I guess one of the fears, I don't want to speak too much about what is happening in the Kremlin, because I guess it's not that important for Ukraine right now. But I guess what is really happening about, for example, 2004, with Yushchenko becoming president, is the fear that, well, that this breakup would now be indefinitely. And so I guess this is really so there is an imperial framework, I guess, inside these people's minds, who would refuse to think of economic independency. As they were able to give in at least some kind of political independency, but they were very I guess spectacle to that.
Fabian, could you just allow me one more minute to respond as a comment? I was actually, again, I was thinking that what you said about this kind of, once if we are politically an independent unit, why should we agree on economic kind of, I don't know, economic dependency or whatever, interdependency? I was actually thinking that it's a very similar argument that we see in the 1920s, in the second half of the 1920s, when with the more strengths the so-called Ukraine-minded communists had, the more they wanted to have also economic independence, and there were also some kind of political programs and some economic I don't know, treaties or whatever written, trying to protest against this Ukraine being a part of the Soviet Union. So this is exactly what was going on. It's just that right in the 1920s, the Soviet Union was much stronger than in the 1990s. So it's exactly, maybe it's a reverse process, right? Because now we have Ukraine kind of getting out of the Union, while there we have Ukraine becoming an integral part of the Union.
That's most interesting,
so, yeah. So Fabian, you have a question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
So thanks, Boris. That was a brilliant lecture, and I learned a lot about the economic history of Ukraine. And I think you have a great point when you say that maybe the debate on colonialism should shift from cultural issues to economics, because I think that really helps us get to the core of things, and also avoid some of the difficult moral debates sometimes associated with it. So actually, I have two questions, not one. The first is, could you maybe say something a little more specific about the role of southern Ukraine, what has been called, and is sometimes, unfortunately, again being called New Russia, whether this sort of settler colonialism in that region sort of impacts the economic dependency, or if even settler colonialism is the right term, I'm not quite sure. And then, if I may, I would also like to ask you about a fourth economic product that you didn't mention yet, namely sugar, sugar beets, and to what extent their role in the modernization and industrialization of Ukrainian agriculture mirrored or differed from grain.
Thank you. Thank you. Both are great questions, and I'm not sure if I have an answer for either of them. But I will start with the question about New Russia, because I guess what is happening here, and that is, I guess, strengthening the argument to take a look at economy, is that after the annexation of these territories, the problem was that it was, since it's pretty much very low populated. I guess the issue for the empire was to fill it with people, to bring people there, to develop the economy, and this led to the fact that, for example, these regions differed in their population towards left and right bank Ukraine. For example, in Odessa, virtually no Ukrainian was residing until the 1860s. So it was a city that was largely dominated by foreigners. And so this was, I guess, the one thing that arose from that was that this region pretty much thought of itself as being a part of the economic imperial framework, but not being part of the adjacent regions in the north. So I guess in the 19th century, this is a story about functionality, about, you know, providing and enabling the empire to make money. But the political implications from that are developing relatively late. So that is the 1870s and 1880s, when the first ideas start to think of what is the specificity of that region, when people decide to stay there for a long time and not to come there just to get rich and then go away. So that is basically a development we can observe in many of these settler colonies, I guess. And I guess settler colonialism in southern Russia ends in the middle of the 19th century, when then this region develops into a different way. But I guess here the term of settler colonialism applies for the 18th and early 19th century, and it helps us to understand why that region is so different from the left and right bank Ukraine that has a completely different way. I think what makes that region particularly interesting is that it connects this settler colonialism type of region with the agricultural regions in the north the moment the Russian Empire starts to export grain, because then this hinterland connection between the ports on the Black Sea and the hinterland start to be particularly interesting. Speaking of sugar, I guess the important difference between grain and sugar is that sugar beets are not a product on their own, right? So they have to be processed in order to get white sugar and to be, to become a product. So the difference is that here, developing an industry, at least processing the raw material that is the beet, is vital. And I guess this is, so that is the reason why that story differs a bit from grain, because grain could be harvested, get into sacks, and then shipped off. So that is not that complicated. But with sugar, we have an industry developing behind that, and that is a story that is kicking in the middle of the 19th century, when entrepreneurs starting to get into that business and to developing industries around that. But as far as I know, there was never the idea to make sugar kind of a second wheat. That means to have something that could be exported in these volumes in order to make money. But this is more about consumption inside the empire, not about export worldwide. Yeah, I guess this would be my answer to that, but I'm not an expert on sugar trade, and I guess there's a great question, and somebody should think more of that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I give the floor to Stefan to ask the question, actually, I was thinking that there is perhaps another commodity, sunflower oil. And I'm saying this because with the start of the war, I remember doing the shopping online, and in the UK there was a huge message that there is a shortage of sunflower oil in the UK because of the war. So please, like, mind that this is something that is lacking. So I guess this is also something perhaps to include in your future presentations.
Sure.
But actually, there is something I was thinking about what you said, that what makes this region different, and in the context of the minority history that I'm working on, right? This is the time when a lot of German settlers came to the region, right? The Germans and the Mennonites, and they completely changed, I mean, not that completely, but they changed the outlook of the region, right? And this is exactly what you're saying. A lot of foreigners came, and this is the legacy, right? We still have it in Ukraine of this ethnic diversity. So I think there are a lot of connections here to make too. Stefan, you have a question.
Yeah, Boris, thanks again for this really insightful presentation. Yeah, it's rather a question remark, and I guess we will not really succeed in this evening to come to a conclusion. I'm really skeptical about the terms colonial and colonialism, especially in the Soviet period. Of course, if you focus on economic aspects, you can actually also gain some insight in these terms. But I'm, from my research, rather focused also on people, for instance, political actors. And there I can see that Ukrainian local regional elites were very well connected to the center in Moscow. So people were actually circulating. And there it's kind of difficult to make such a division between rulers and rule, because in Ukraine, if we take the population together, they were both somehow. But we want to come to a conclusion. But if you could give a brief reply.
Thank you. I think it was hard to hear, but I guess I got what you were barking on. I really want to say I completely share your your feeling towards that framework of colonialism. The reason why I take it that prominently was that it is quite often used right now. So it's something people tend to think about of Ukraine when making sense of it. And I guess what is, I guess my answer would be twofold. So the one is that colonial and post-colonial history has taught us that this distinction between rulers and ruled is a complex one in basically every colonial setting. So it's not about just telling one side, the other what to do, and that's it. It's about providing information from the local sphere to the center, and so on and so on. But the other perspective I want to give is that it's still, I think, vital to think of that basically Moscow in the Soviet Union decided for Ukraine what the economy should be about. And I guess this is something that is quite typical for that kind of setting, because this had some trajectories that would then ultimately, contribute to some kind of problems. And I guess in that sense, from a strict economic perspective, it might had at least a grain of salt to think of that. But I completely share your feeling that maybe it's not appropriate to think of Ukraine being a colony in the Soviet Union, especially since I just want to briefly remind you that many officials in the upper echelons of the Communist Party were Ukrainians, at least in the second half of the 20th century. So this is the specific situation inside the Soviet Union for Ukraine, I guess, that it's simultaneously at the core and then forced by the center to develop in some economic directions.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience, or comments or suggestions, perhaps? If not, then I would like to thank Boris for this really enlightening lecture and a lot of interesting and useful insights into Ukraine's economic history. And I would like to remind everyone that next week we will have a lecture entitled Origins of Slavic Mythology, Historical Tradition and Contemporary Reality by Dr. Lyubov Lankina from the Universidad Internacional de Cuernavaca in Mexico. So please join us next week, and I will be sending you the link to the recording of this lecture. Thank you once again, Boris, and thank you everyone for joining today's lecture.
Thank you all. Enjoy your evening.